So this is a real important consideration that I want to talk through in regards to position of the feet within the squat. Now, a lot of people, if you look at schools of thought from Kelly Starrett, Gray Cook, they tend to differ a good little bit. Gray Cook, on one end, says you should have a little bit of a natural toe flare when you squat. Starrett comes from the school of thought that your toe flare should be minimal at best, anywhere from 0 to 5 degrees. And his version of a quote-unquote healthy ankle, whatever standard you're basing that upon, I'm not sure, but a healthy ankle should be able to squat with the toes straight ahead, no problems. However, the one thing that you have to consider is the need for individual differences, obviously within the squat or any other lift for that matter. But you can't just look at the ankle, you also have to look at the rest of the kinetic chain, specifically at the position of the hips. And what I've noticed kind of anecdotally in myself, I think that I fall into a little bit of anteversion of the hip. And what I mean by anteversion is that if you're thinking two normal femurs, and your pelvis is here, two normal femurs as they insert into the pelvis, are actually, the head of the femur is slightly rotated forward. So in order for you to get congruency between your pelvis and the head of the femur, you actually have to internally rotate your femur back into the socket. So a lot of times these people will present with more of a pigeon-toed posture, or turned in slightly. And you can test this out for yourself. I've done it on myself, which is kind of where I started to put the pieces together, is when you're deadlifting, you may feel that when your toes are pointing straight ahead or even slightly flared, as some people use, that when you get to the top, you can't really get a whole lot, or you can't really get maximal glute contraction or activation. And so you feel like you get to the top, but your lockout isn't as strong as it should be. So what you can try to do is turn your toes in anywhere from 0 to 5 degrees. And then, as you're going through your pull, you'll find at the top, when the hips come through, now because you've actually established or re-established congruency with your femurs in your hip sockets, now when you go to externally rotate, you're taking yourself to end range, whereas before you were basically establishing a bony block. So, when it comes to squatting and the toe position, we have to look at that exact same morphology at the hip. You can have the opposite, which is called retroversion, where basically, instead of the hips being rotated forward, now the hips are rotated slightly, or the head of the femur, I should say, are rotated slightly backwards in the socket. So what do you have to do? Now you have to actually externally rotate the feet a little bit in order to give yourself that congruency. Now, you can't go down the rabbit trail and say, oh, well, I turned my feet out because my hips are retroverted, that's just what I have to do. No, it could be that you just have crappy biomechanics, and you have either a faulty foot position where you have no arches and your feet roll in, and so then because of that, you're causing other compensations up the kinetic chain, which then most people who their feet roll in, you'll see them squat wide, the arches will collapse, and the knees will kind of hang out in here. That's not a position of your hip. It's weak external rotators coupled with a poor base of support and stability through the arch of the foot. That's a whole nother rabbit trail though. My point being that you can't blame a poor position on an anatomical abnormality. Back to my regular point regarding the toes though. So in the squat, one of the things that you may find is when you're squatting, as you're going down, if you experience a pinching phenomenon within the knee specifically, or you feel like with a toe flare, you can't really push your knees out any further, they're all the way out, then what you may find is actually turning the toes back in is going to give you that congruency, and as you squat below 90 degrees, the femur has to internally rotate. So what I mean is, as you're coming down in this bottom position, you're going to need a slight amount of external or internal rotation. My point in making this video is that there's other videos out, one by a guy by the name of Tom Purvis, specifically, I think that's his name. If not, you can look it up, and it's basically a model made up of some sort of metal, but it's basically to simulate the 4 segments within the squat. First segment being the foot, second segment being the ankle to the knee, third segment being the knee to the hip, and then fourth segment being the hip to the shoulder. You could add a 5th segment, shoulder to the base of the head, but we won't. Anyways, in this model, what he says is that basically, obviously, limb lengths are going to determine the way you squat, knees over toes and such like that. However, what I want to look at is from an anatomical position. If the hips move just in the sagittal plane, then sure, his model would be great. But the fact of the matter is the hips don't just move in the sagittal plane during a squat. It is a sagittal plane exercise, but the hips also move internally and externally throughout the exercise. So because of that, now we're incorporating multiple planes, specifically the transverse plane as the hip rotates. Whichever way you want to look at it, we can discuss axes versus planes and all that, but getting back to that model, what you have to consider is that each joint is going to be influenced by the ones above and below it. So because of that, if you're experiencing issues, you can't always default to turn your toes out, everyone needs to do it, or keep your toes straight. So what I would recommend is play around with both. If you keep the toes pointed straight ahead and you're a taller lifter, you may have to use a slightly wider stance, which is what Purvis recommends, because now you're having to sit the hips in between sit the pelvis in between the legs, and in order to stay more upright, you'll need a slightly wider stance. Similarly, if you go a little bit more narrow, now you just may incur more forward lean. So there's nothing wrong with either strategy. It just depends on your limb lengths. So try out feet straight ahead, try turning the toes out, and you should be able to feel it within the hips, and if not within the hips, within the knees. So any sort of pinching or anything like that, any feedback, pay attention to it, and then modify the position either at the hip, knees out, or allowing the knees not to be pushed so drastically out and allowing them that slight valgus twitch as you push them to the floor, or at the ankle, changing the position of the toes. Give it a shot. Let me know what you think in the comment section below.